More than 20 years ago, you decided to write about the genesis and development of sleep patterns at the phase of adolescence. In this book, you address topics like how older teenagers tend to be sleepier during the day than the younger ones. And you also talk about how adolescents' biological clock shifts so they start to feel sleepy later at night. What made you write a book about the sleep cycle at this phase?
I think the book you're referring to is a book that I was the editor for. So I only wrote parts of it. And back then, people didn't really know as much about adolescent sleep and the challenges that changes in biology raise for adolescents to get enough sleep. It's interesting. This autumn, I'm giving an address at the European Sleep Conference, the title of which is A Half Century of Adolescent Sleep. So I've actually been studying adolescent sleep for 50 years. And, it's one of these things that it takes a while to push information from the laboratory out to the public. So that's why you write books and book chapters and newspaper articles.
You just said back then they didn't know as much. Why did people start caring more about this topic?
I think as society has changed and technology has become a bigger part of our lives, and the risks now about not getting adequate sleep are known better, and the importance of a proper sleep and sort of cognitive development during adolescence have become more well known. And so I think people are more and more invested in the topic and the issue. And then I don't know about your country, but in the United States, a big concern has been the timing of the school day and students having to go to school so early in the morning. And if their biology is pushing their sleep later, then sort of sleep gets squeezed out of their day, and so they can't get enough sleep. So there's a big public health push in the United States to move the school day start time later than what it's been for a couple decades now.
You spent your childhood in a small town in Pennsylvania called Elizabethtown. Later on, you studied psychology at Gettysburg College. Now you're a successful professor at the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior at the Warren Alpert Medical School of Brown University. How did a small-town girl become an important scientist focusing on sleep patterns, and how did you achieve your main goal successfully?
Wow, that question goes back even more than 50 years. It's interesting. It's very interesting. When I was a child, the world had undergone a lot of upheavals and was in a more stable condition, I guess, at that time. And so that gave me stability and roots to build my, my intellect and my education. And I was a bit of a stubborn young person. And I went to Gettysburg College because my advisor in high school said, "You'll never get into Gettysburg College." So I only applied there, and I went there. I mean, when I say stubborn and sort of dumb, in terms of balking at restrictions, I had something to show and something to prove. I had lovely, wonderful professors, and I learned a lot, but But when I graduated from college, it was in a much less stable time because in the United States, there was great upheaval regarding the Vietnam War. And so there were many protest marches. I remember one huge march that I participated in Washington, D.C. So it was a march against the Vietnam War. And so it was hard for people my generation to figure out what to do next, what to do when we grew up, I guess. So ultimately, I got a position as a research assistant at Stanford University and in a sleep research laboratory. So I learned a lot from the ground up about sleep, and I became interested in sleep in adolescence. And so I did my PhD degree at Stanford, and the adolescent sleep story was a big part of it. And then, as you say, I moved to Brown University, where I'm now a professor. And I don't know, these things sort of just follow one after the other. I never had an ambition to grow up and become a professor at Brown University. My ambition when I was in college was to become a college English professor in English literature because I loved English literature, and that didn't happen. So, we have these dreams and we have these ideas, and then we get caught up in what we're doing day after day, and life moves on.
Melatonin in low doses can adjust the circadian rhythm. Can you explain the reasons why this happens and how it can affect the sleep on teenagers or affect their daily routines?
I'll do my best, Diego. Thank you for that question. One of the hardest kinds of questions to answer in science is how or why. And so I don't have a good answer for how or why in terms of the circadian rhythm change, but it certainly has an impact on the timing of sleep day by day in adolescence. Now, some people have speculated that the change in the circadian timing system during adolescent development may be a holdover from early human evolution. And so I call this may be challenging for you, but I call it the temporal niche hypothesis. So if you think about it, when teenagers are able, because of their biology, to stay awake later than when they were little children, that may have, again, back in the early days of humanity, have provided a population in a small village or group of humans for people who can stay awake later and be kind of the guards or guardians of the village or the small group of humans because they're awake and alert later at night. And then that becomes vestigial or a leftover in the 21st century and probably not really serving any useful function in the same way. Now that's all hypothesis and theory. And what's interesting is when you think about studies of evolution, you think about things like digging up dinosaur bones or digging up human bones, but there's nothing to dig up when it comes to sleep or circadian rhythms. So that's why it's just kind of theory and not really based in any factual leftovers.
I've I've researched medications like benzodiazepines and quetiapine, and now I know that ingesting them increases the risk of addiction or even movement problems. How do these medications affect you over a long period of time, and how can they affect teenagers particularly?
Thank you. If you're referring to medications that you take for example, for colds or fever or something, not so much. But if you're talking about drugs that you might take for, I don't know, for a thrill or a high, then not getting enough sleep really increases the willingness or the need for adolescents to start taking these substances. Over time, of course, they have a very bad impact on brain development and behavior. And I think it's part of the reason we want to help teenagers get more sleep is so they won't be taking these risks. Now, what's interesting is one of the sort of substances that we don't think of as a medication, but a lot of people take, is probably the most commonly used mind-altering substance in the whole planet. And can you guess what that might be?
¿Sabes cuál es la sustancia que se utiliza en general para drogarse realmente? No?
No guess. Well, it's caffeine.
Caffeine. Okay?
Okay.
Do you know what caffeine is?
Yes.
Yeah, it will boost your alertness and, at least for a short time, make you feel better. But if you take too much of it, or you take it at the wrong time, it can make your sleep worse. When your sleep is worse, then your brain development is impacted as well. So it can have a long-term effect on you.
What are the main causes of sleepwalking on teenagers?
Oh, sleepwalking. Is that what you were saying?
Yes.
The other name for that, the long name for that, is somnambulism. You don't have to worry about that. But usually we think of somnambulism as more genetically or in its origin. So, for example, if your parents were sleepwalkers, you're more likely to be a sleepwalker. And sleepwalking is more common in younger children than in teenagers. But it can happen in teenagers because they aren't getting enough sleep. So one of the things we know about sleepwalking is that it occurs during the deepest kind of sleep, and the less sleep you have, in general, the more your sleep contains very deep sleep. And it's thought to be this conflict between deep sleep and arousal that occurs in your brain. And so usually, if your brain wakes up and says, let's walk, you wake up and you walk to the toilet or wherever. But if your sleep is so deep that your brain arousal doesn't overcome the deep sleep, then instead of waking up to go to the toilet, you may start walking in your sleep. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
In an interview with CNN, you explained that teenagers' circadian rhythms change, relying their natural sleep patterns. How might this affect teenagers' attention spans in school?
Great question. Thank you for repeating it. So, when your sleep is delayed and you have to get up early to go to school, then you don't get enough sleep. When you don't get enough sleep, then you can't focus and concentrate, so you have less attention. One of of the other interesting things, Miguel, can you tell me what time your school starts in the morning?
9 a.m.
Oh, that's pretty good. Imagine if your school started at 7 a.m.
Like in the United States.
Yeah. It would be awful, right?
Crazy.
And what we see in teenagers whose school starts that early, that when they're in school, they can't attend, they can't focus, because their brain should be in bed asleep. And we see really good evidence of that. And so that's the rhythm. It's both not getting enough sleep, but it's also the rhythm that when you're waking at 7 o'clock, you're waking when it's the time from the rhythm for you to be asleep. And so it's really, really a challenge. When we did that science, I'm there, oh my heavens, these poor kids. How can they focus? How can they learn? And that's one of the things that's a mystery for me, is how schools can ignore that and still start so early in the morning. I recently learned that some school districts in the state of Florida, here in the United States, decided they would start school at 7:15 in the morning. To me, that's really harmful to the students and to their ability to learn. Because if you can't be awake, if you can't, as you say, focus and have attention, then you're not going to learn as well. So, yeah, it's a problem, it's a challenge, and the rhythm moving later, if the school is moving earlier, you're going to get that kind of conflict.
Yeah. You have won numerous awards, including the Sleep Research Society Distinguished Science Award. In what ways do you think your work has contributed to the advancement of this field in science?
That's a very interesting question, Diego, that I've never been asked before. So I'm going to give it a little bit of thought. I think, when I receive these awards, they're usually presented at a conference. And so when I'm at the conference accepting the award, the contribution of me receiving the award is that people sort of hear about what I've done and learn a little bit more about it, and may be inspired to do research in the area or to learn more about it. When you look beyond the scientists who would be at those conferences, it's little more challenging to see the difference that the award makes, outside the scientific community. It does, I don't know, makes me feel good when I receive the awards. It's not like last night the Oscars were given out for movies. Those millions of people see those awards. That's not how those awards you mentioned are distributed. But it sure would be fun if it were, right? Get all dressed up and go to this big event. But no, it's just at our conferences. Thank you for asking that.
Do you think that teenagers in the future can resolve their lack of sleep problems?
Yes, but I think they need the help of society. What's interesting, it's harder, I mentioned earlier this public health issue about the starting time for school, and not every teenager is affected as much by early school, and so some kids don't need or don't suffer, but the majority seem to. And so it's easier to help teenagers by putting in a regulation or a rule or a policy that helps them get more sleep by having school start later. Now, you don't have to worry about that because you have a great school start time. But the other place I see where help could be offered overall, not just to one one child here, one child there, one child somewhere else, is in what's happening in the evening. So there are many things that can interfere with sleep for teenagers, including what? Social media, right? Electronic game playing, lights on in the evening, and even homework. Do you have homework in your school?
Do you have homework?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So if there's too much homework, guess what? Then you stay up later and later to finish your homework. You know what bothers me the most is when teachers assign homework where it's due at 11:59 p.m. So 1 minute before midnight. So when I think of teenagers, and I think back to my own teenage years, I think, what self-respecting teenager will submit their homework early and not wait until the last minute to turn it in? So that means they're staying up late just to, get their homework in on time. So that's another challenge that could be changed to help teenagers do better. And I think, giving teenagers access to caffeine late in the day, that pushes sleep later as well, and that can make sleep less. Do you think you get enough sleep together?
What?
Do you think you get enough sleep?
Sí, seguro es lo suficiente.
No.
No? Why not?
My family always watch TV in the evening because we love TV.
Uh-huh. So what would help you get more sleep?
Yeah, watching TV.
Maybe if your family didn't watch so much TV in the evening.
Yeah.
Or if they said, okay, Miguel, your turn to go to bed. Good night.
Yes.
What would they say? Buenas noches.
Yeah.
Yes. It can't, I think you raise an important point. It can't be all on the individual teenager. They need help from the community and family to do better. So you'll do better, maybe, I hope.
Thank you.
Okay. Now,
Thank you for your questions.
You developed the multiple sleep latency test to help with the diagnosis of sleepiness in sleep-disordered patients. How did you develop this project so that the results provide the right information?
Thank you for that question. This is one of my favorite topics because it amazes me that something I developed starting almost 50 years ago is still used in sleep disorders medicine clinics today. I'm there. How is this possible? It started as well when I went to Stanford University as a research assistant. There was really the startup of sleep disorders medicine in the United States. And my mentor, Dr. Dement, was very interested in sleepiness in his patients who were sleepy. And he was concerned that he wasn't able to measure how sleepy someone is, other than say, how sleepy are you? And they would say, oh, I'm very sleepy. And then he couldn't really measure how well his treatments were working. Now, how sleepy are you today? Still pretty sleepy or not very sleepy. It's like, so he encouraged our team to start working on a measure. And the multiple sleep latency test actually rose from an experiment we had done where we asked people in the laboratory to sleep on what we called a 90-minute day. So this was an interesting experiment. They were allowed to sleep for 30 minutes, and then they were awake for 60 minutes. 30, 60, 30, 60, on and on and on, because we were curious about how the brain and the cognition and sleepiness and alertness would work on that very short day length. Well, it turns out that when we had them sleep for 30 minutes, and this was around the clock, we saw that how long it took them to fall asleep differed around the clock. And so I had this thought that, well, maybe we could measure that speed of falling asleep. The other name for it is sleep latency, multiple times, and look at that speed of falling asleep as a way to gauge or measure sleepiness. Turns out it's a very, very good measure of how sleepy people are. Furthermore, the kind of sleep that you have when you fall asleep is a significant measure or indicator of healthy sleep or narcolepsy. Have you heard about narcolepsy?
It rings a bell, but I don't really know what it is.
Well, it's a sleep disorder that's pretty common, and in narcolepsy, it has interesting symptoms. Sleep is endlessly fascinating, by the way. We have two kinds of sleep at night: non-REM sleep and REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which is when we dream. So our brain is very active, but our body is paralyzed. So we dream, and it's all happening up here, but we don't move around in our dream. And people who have narcolepsy will, instead of what is healthy and normal for you and me, they will fall asleep by going directly from awake right into REM sleep. And they'll have that paralysis too soon. And even when they're awake, they may experience that paralysis. And so by doing the multiple sleep latency tests 4 or 5 times a day, we measure how long it takes them to fall asleep. Patients with narcolepsy fall asleep very fast, and what kind of sleep they have when they do fall asleep. So people with narcolepsy fall right into REM sleep, whereas you and I would not. So it worked, I guess, to answer your question. How did we develop it? That's how it came about. But then it turned out to be very valuable in gauging sleepiness and in helping to diagnose people with narcolepsy.
You have also contributed important research on school starting time because you suggest that circadian rhythms shift in teenagers and that high school should start later. This research has even resulted in proposed changes in public policy. Could you explain how circadian rhythms affect the students' classwork and grades when it comes to school schedules?
Thank you. So one of what I think is a very important study that we did many years ago was to measure the sleep and the multiple sleep latency test in teenagers who they were in year 9. Okay, so what year are you in?
Here we are in first of SO,
Seventh.
7th grade.
7th, okay. So these were teenagers a little older than you, and they had to be in school at 7:20 in the morning. So we measured them, and then when the new school year started, what, did I get it backwards? No. When the new school year started, their school day started an hour later, which was nice. But what we found was so we would measure their sleep all week long. They were getting not enough sleep, about 7 hours, which is not enough sleep. 7 hours, just so you know, all the school nights. And then we had them come into our laboratory on Friday night and all day Saturday. And on Saturday, we did that multiple sleep latency test. So in the year when school started at 7:20 in the morning, they weren't getting enough sleep. But when we brought them into the laboratory and we measured how quickly they fell asleep, what kind of sleep they fell into, we found that, now this was pretty impressive. At our first test was at 8:30 in the morning. So that would be, in their usual school days, they'd have been in school for more than an hour. Well, they fell asleep in about 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah, so that's pretty fast, right?
Yeah.
And furthermore, if they had a delay in their circadian time, they fell asleep into REM sleep, so they didn't have narcolepsy, but our REM sleep naturally is kind of regulated by our circadian rhythm. So yeah, that told me that these kids, if you're falling asleep in 2 or 3 minutes and you're sitting there trying to listen to your lovely teacher, as you all have, he probably has to dance on the desk and table and be very exciting to keep you awake, and which isn't fair to the teacher, but it also means that if he's not doing those things, then you're as likely as not to just fall asleep or drift off and not be paying attention. And so it has the biggest impact on morning classes. And then if you're in school late in the afternoon, those rhythms can also affect the late afternoon classes as well. So will it impact your grades? Likely, but it will certainly impact your attention and ability to keep up with your teacher.
You said that caffeine is like a drug that makes sleeping more difficult because it excites the brain. But what other side effects can it have on people like us?
Well, I don't really think there are a lot of side effects. I mean, so we wrote a grant a number of years ago to do research to look at specifically at caffeine and sleep and circadian rhythms in teenagers. That did not get funded because the reviewers said, well, this is all known in grown-ups. And I'm there, teenagers are not really grown-ups. You should let us study it in teenagers. But what we think may happen, and this is what happens in grown-ups, if you consume caffeine late in the day, like in the afternoon or the evening, it will push rhythms even later. So that making it then harder because the rhythms are more delayed and because the brain is more aroused, it makes it harder to fall asleep at night. So that's another effect. So, when we drink caffeine in the morning and it helps us rev up for the morning, that's a good thing. But when it pushes our rhythms later or keeps us from falling asleep, not so good.
And what about high-powered drinks like Red Bull or Monster that are very popular with teenagers?
They just make it worse. I mean, the other thing, when you drink those drinks, it turns up your heart rate, and it has brain effects, but it also has other effects throughout your body. And it's just, I think life and health work better when we're not pushing beyond what's normal and healthy. And taking those monster drinks is not normal and healthy. And, it can affect not just your brain, but also your heart and other parts of your body. I'm not sure they have a specific and special impact in teenagers. Again, this is something that we say, oh, we know it in grown-ups, but is it the same in teenagers? We don't really know for sure because that science hasn't been done. But if there are specific effects in teenagers, they just, in my opinion, make it worse than it is in grown-ups.
You are the director of the Radley Hospital Sleep Research Laboratory, director of the Corbett Center for Sleep and Circadian Rhythms in Child and Adolescent Mental Health, and a diplomate of the American Board of Sleep Medicine. How are your research projects particularly developing at each one of these institutions, and which one is your favorite and why?
Wow, big question. Okay. So my sleep lab that I'm directing right now is doing a few interesting studies that are less related to adolescent sleep than in the past because I had to get funding to pay the bills. So right now we have a study that's looking at how taking medicine to treat, this is in grown-ups, taking medicine to treat their opioid addiction affects sleep and circadian rhythms. That's very, very different from my adolescent sleep because it's a disorder and it's one that's treated with medicine. So let's set that aside. Another study we're working on that's very exciting, and this is in young adults. So because it's looking at the effects of light on fatigue and alertness and circadian rhythms in young people the age of sailors, for example. Indeed, we're studying, I think next month, we'll be looking to implement this study in sailors who work for the National Oceanographic something, NOAA. So we're going to have these sailors on their ships with lights that are designed by a special company to do this. And then we'll be measuring their alertness and fatigue. So that's a little different. And then another study, now we come back to adolescents that we're very interested in, is looking at young people who have a genetic variability for Alzheimer's disease. You know what Alzheimer's disease is?
Yes.
Okay, that's usually thought of as an illness in old people. But what we are looking for is to see if we see signs. So we have children who are 10, 11, 12 years old who have that genetic vulnerability and children who don't. And we measure their sleep, we measure their sleepiness, we measure their circadian rhythms. Are there signals in the vulnerable group compared to the non-vulnerable group that can speak to early signs potentially of Alzheimer's disease when people grow up? And so the point there would be, will these map onto potential treatments to either help people who have Alzheimer's disease or even prevent Alzheimer's disease from occurring? So that's a very, very, very exciting piece of our research it's kind of, well, is it focused on teenagers? Well, yes, but it's also focused on what can happen over a lifespan. So I think that's interesting. It is to me. So that's my lab now. When we talk about the Center for Sleep and Circadian Rhythms in Child and Adolescent Mental Health, which is a long name, there are 7 or 8 very, very interesting studies going on that actually are not my research, but my center is funding other junior people to do research. For example, one study is looking at suicide sort of indicators. So when teenagers start thinking, I think I want to kill myself. It's called suicidal ideation. So you start thinking about committing suicide and seeing how that relates to their timing of their sleep and their thinking as they're trying to fall asleep, especially if their rhythms are delayed. So thinking bad thoughts or negative thoughts as they try to fall asleep, not thinking positive thoughts. And so that's an interesting study. And that study also includes MRI, so brain imaging as part of it. Then we have another study, another group who's looking at cannabis use. You know cannabis,
Cannabis es marihuana.
Yes,
marijuana.
yes.
So looking at teenage cannabis use and how that affects their sleep and circadian rhythms, and how the cannabis use and how sleep and circadian rhythms make it more likely that someone would use, a teenager would use cannabis. Trying to think, what are some of the others? There are some others looking at young teenagers who have autism and looking at their sleep. The goal for many of these is to figure out a way how to make things better. So people have known for many years that children and adolescents who have autism have poor sleep. And so part of what that project is trying to do is to really nail down what the components of the poor sleep are, and to figure out, is there a way to make sleep better in these young people who have serious mental illness. So, I could go on, but there's a series of studies that these they're mostly psychologists who treat people with mental illness are doing. So I find those very, very interesting. And then, what was the third one? My lab, the center.
¿Cuál dijiste? ¿Qué institución dijiste última?
And the diploma of the American Board of Sleep Medicine.
Oh, okay. That's not really research. So I'm just involved in sort of more advisory capacity in that. But I would say one other thing about research that I'm really enjoying is research projects that are being done by my college students. So one of my college students has a data set where he's looking at how regular, day after day, the light input is, and whether the light regularity day after day
Hello?
sleep patterns. So that's an exciting study. And so, there's a lot of research going on here. Most of it I enjoy, but most of it isn't my own personal science right now. I'll get back to it when I get funded.
The Carskadon laboratory also hosts teenagers who stay at the sleep laboratory for 14 days during the summer. The teenagers participate in activities similar to those at a summer camp, while their sleep is monitored every night. Could you describe the process followed during the research and what are the best results you obtained?
Well, we've done, over my career, I've done a lot of studies where we bring children and adolescents into the laboratory for a few nights or days in the summer. That really started when I was at Stanford, and we learned a ton with that research. But you mentioned the longer episodes. So our laboratory, so part of studying circadian rhythms is that it's really hard to do, especially in humans, especially in young humans. And so there's this very interesting experiment that was first done in grown-ups that we took and applied to younger people. It's called forced desynchrony. So it's where you have people, in our case teenagers, live in our lab, which is in a underground setting where we control the lights and the temperature and the meals and so on and so forth. So it's everything. Is it like summer camp? No. Excuse me. Because you don't get to go outside and play, or go swimming or, rowboating or horse riding or anything. You're in the laboratory, and our laboratory is 4 bedrooms, so we can have 4 teenagers at a time. And I have my college students who are trained to work with the teenagers all day long when they're awake, and to get them all hooked up to measure their sleep and so forth. And so this forced desynchrony. So the point is, what's interesting, it's hard to do these things without laying more groundwork, but I'm doing the best I can. Your rhythms, your circadian rhythms, circadian means about a day. So your internal circadian rhythms are not exactly 24 hours. But when we live in society, they're synchronized to the society signals and to the day and night signals that we get. And so they look like they're 24 hours. So what this experimental study does is takes them out of their natural light, natural social cues, puts them in our lab, dim light all the time, and we have them sleep on a schedule that instead of 24 hours is 28 hours. So every cycle, I guess you would say, they stay awake for, excuse me, they go to bed 4 hours later than the cycle before, and they get up 4 hours later than the cycle before. We give them the opportunity to sleep more than 8 hours on each of those nights because their days are 28 hours long. So by doing that, their rhythms are not able to keep up with or synchronize to 28 hours. And they no longer have, so it would be like this if they no longer have the 24-hour signal. So they break free. It's called free running, and their internal day length is revealed. And that's what we want to measure. And what we see, so it takes a long time and it's hard work to get that measure, because as you say, it's 14 days. Well, the first time we did it was 21 days. It was 3 weeks. And having teenagers give us 3 weeks of their summer, I mean, they got paid a little bit of money, so it wasn't just a gift from them, although it kind of was. Anyway, so we were able to measure, and on average, in the teenagers, the day length, the internal day length was 24.12 hours. And we compare that to another study that was done in grown-ups. We see that the day length is longer in the teenagers than in the grown-ups. So that can be part of the mechanism that delays rhythms in adolescence. Boy, I really went off the line there and got pretty deep in the research weeds, and I hope it isn't too confusing for you.
How can insomnia affect biologic change in a person's evolution, particularly in teenagers?
Well, insomnia is interesting, and a lot of times in teenagers, what feels like insomnia is really more that circadian phase delay. So if your circadian rhythms are late, but you try to go to bed early and you can't fall asleep, that kind of insomnia is really related to your biological clock. But most other kinds of insomnia is more likely related to, could be related to what you ate, could be related to the caffeine that you consume, but it also could be related to anxiety. So worry can contribute a big amount of the challenge to sleep well. And so that, that combination of anxiety and insomnia can really be a very challenging problem for teenagers and for adults. So, you know, there are treatments. I'm not a clinician, so I don't do the treatments, but there are treatments that rely on what they used to call talk therapy. So the doctors help you understand what's going on and help you diminish the anxiety and help you sleep better.
In recent years, numerous studies have shown that teenagers are sleeping less and less, and one of the most frequently cited factors is the use of electronic devices and screens. Given your research on adolescent sleep, to what extent does the screen use, cell phone, tablet, or computer before bed actually influence sleep deprivation in teenagers? And what evidence-based strategies will you recommend to reduce this impact without relying solely on prohibitions?
Screens themselves probably don't have a huge impact. I mean, there's some theory out there that the screens affect the clock and push it later, the light from the screens, and that's still a little bit uncertain, I guess. The real problem with electronic device use is more that it's substituting for sleep. So it's taking the place of sleep. And if it's social media, if it's, you know, those games and so forth that really are arousing and engaging, sorry, then it's worse and worse in terms of taking away sleep. So I don't have evidence for this strategy because you asked for a strategy, evidence-based strategy that doesn't involve prohibition, right?
Yes.
Yes. Dream on. I mean, you know, we could shut down the internet at 9 p.m., right? That would do it. The first time I ever heard about the World Wide Web and the internet and so forth, my solution for teenagers was, we'll just have a rolling blackout of internet services around the globe that protects teenagers from being on the internet when they should be sleeping. I don't think that's possible, but it would be interesting. I think one thing that families could do this is my other brilliant idea, the family lockbox for devices. So everybody in the family, including parents, uncles and aunts, your pet, you know, poodle or whatever, every night, every evening, you put all your devices in a box that gets locked until morning, and it charges your devices, but it keeps them. So that's not really necessarily targeting teenagers alone. It's also targeting parents, because parents are terrible role models, right? I can't speak to your parents, but in general, parents are there clickety-click, you know, into the night. So that would be a strategy. No evidence for that, but I think it's a way somebody could make $1 million if they invented this device. I mean, the other thing would be, and again, it's not complete prohibition, but to limit screen use at night, but to make it freely available in the morning. So that, you know, you're not staying up later, pushing your rhythms later, and potentially by waking up in the morning and doing your screen time and so forth, you could be pulling your rhythms earlier, which would help with sleep. And also, because you're teenagers, you're less likely to wake up even if you have the lure of screen time early in the morning to use them. But it's really, I mean, you know it's a tough challenge. That's why you asked the question, right? And again, I don't have all the answers. I have these squirrely ideas. But it's a challenge. It is a challenge. I don't know. Do you have any ideas?
No, I don't know.
In the 1990s, your studies at the Bradley Hospital Laboratory at Brown University showed that during puberty, the circadian rhythm slows down and melatonin release occurs later, which explains why many teenagers can fall asleep early even if they try. 3 decades later, what are the most important unanswered questions about adolescent sleep, and on what directions should future research take to better understand and support teenagers' biological rhythms?
I always sort of have trouble answering the biggest unanswered questions, kind of issues that are raised. I think what really we need to know more about is, are there genetic risks that could help us personalize approaches to these issues for individual adolescents. In other words, if we knew, for example, that your genes made you more susceptible to the challenges of bright lights in the evening or screen time in the evening, well then maybe we could work with you in a different way than another student who doesn't have that inherent biological vulnerability. So I think, even if we wouldn't use the information in quite that way, learning more about the genetics of these things and what's going on. Have you ever heard of, you know about DNA and genes?
Yes.
Right? Have you ever heard of epigenetics?
No.
No, I hadn't heard of it either until about 10 or 12 years ago. But to me, it's fascinating because, and what we're learning is, because the environment you live in or you behave in can change your genes. Not the genes, but it can change the conformation of genes, making them more or less able to do their job. So not changing the genes per se, they attach to or modify. There's a process called methylation, which really can turn on or turn off the activity of a specific gene. And we did a little study a number of years ago. We had a project looking at college students in their first year at university, and we had them keep track of their sleep for 9 weeks. And we drew blood samples at the beginning of the 9 weeks and at the end of the 9 weeks. And we had the scientists who know how to do this work do their DNA methylation, this epigenetic analysis. And one of the things that people have found is that there are certain changes that when you look at them in this very sophisticated way, they can tell you what your biological age is, which could be different from your chronological age. And so when we looked at those epigenetic markers in college students over the course of 9 weeks, and also looked at their sleep behavior, we found that the students who for those 9 weeks were getting the least amount of sleep and the most irregular sleep also were getting biologically older. And those with more sleep, more regular sleep, got a little bit biologically younger. So that's 9 weeks. If you think about those changes over years or decades, they could really have an impact that's very, very significant on our health and our aging. So I think this approach, by using epigenetic, what are the changes that the teenagers' sleep patterns themselves are doing to the genes, and how, and so the aging is maybe one thing, but there are other less, big, huge things that could be impacted by these epigenetic influences. So they could be making the teenager's sleep worse. I mean, most of the things that you learn about go both ways. It's called bidirectional. So sometimes sleep can make you more depressed. I mean, not enough sleep can make you more depressed. But the more depressed you are, the less sleep you get. So it's like bidirectional. So I think we need a better way of understanding those and figuring out what is the best way to, because a lot of teenagers are not doing well with their mental health. They're sad, they're anxious, they're moody, they're irritable, they're really obnoxious. No, sorry. Didn't mean to say that one. No, so how can we improve how they feel by maybe helping with their circadian rhythms and then their sleep biology to have a good impact on all those other things.
Okay.
Is there any difference in sleep on teenagers between different countries in the world?
For me, so the basic biology is probably very similar. But the circumstances, the environment in which teenagers are sleeping can be very, very different. It was interesting. I gave a talk a number of years ago in Abu Dhabi. Do you know where Abu Dhabi is?
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah, sort of, yeah. So that's a desert country that's usually very, very warm around the year. And I was, doing my usual thing about school start time and so forth. And one of the teachers stopped me and he said, Professor Carskadon, this school start time, starting later, is not really a very good idea in Abu Dhabi because if we start school later and then have to go through the middle of the day, it's just too hot to have school. And most of the schools don't have air conditioning to help with moderating the heat in the middle of the day. So he said, we really have to start earlier so we can have school at a temperate time, temperature-wise, and then again late in the day after a break in the hottest part of the day. And that really made me think about and try to understand a little differently how, I make these big pronouncements that may not be helpful entirely around the world because things are different. And cultural differences are also part of what changes sleep. There was a paper not too long ago, actually two papers from South America about how culture changes when teenagers can sleep. In one of the cultures, the families stayed up late because of religious reasons. So that's hard to, interfere with. And one of the countries didn't have that. And so, it makes a difference. There was another study looking at the sleep of teenagers who lived and this was in Brazil. So I think in Brazil and India and China, more so than in your country and my country, there are areas where there is no electrical power, right? And so that eliminates some of these issues about screen time and technology and so forth. And the study looked at teenagers who lived in a village that had electrical power and compared their sleep patterns to teenagers who lived in a village that did not have electrical power. Guess who slept earlier and longer?
Tomados con electrical power. ¿Quién durmió más? ¿El que tenía electricidad o el que no tenía electricidad?
Who didn't have electricity.
Exactly. So when you ask, are there differences in different countries that affect adolescent sleep? Yes, there are. I mean, I've always been very curious about the sleep of teenagers in in India, for example, where there may be no electrical power in millions and millions of families, or in China, same. So, but nobody's really pushing that research window very well. So, but I'm convinced there are major cultural, economic, and other differences around the globe in how teenagers are sleeping.